The morning Sella Vance arrived in Dunmore, Alberta, the wind came off the prairie like it had a grudge. She had $43, a trunk that wouldn't close properly, and a letter from a man named Gideon Holt, promising room, board, and a wage in exchange for keeping house and minding 2 children while he worked the cattle. The agency in Toronto had called it a domestic placement. The woman at the desk had called it a fresh start. Sela called it the only option left after the bank took the house and her mother's medical bills ate what the bank didn't. She hadn't told anyone that part. She wasn't the type to explain herself. The train platform was empty except for a wagon, and a man standing beside it, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was tall enough that she noticed it immediately, wide through the shoulders in the way of men, who'd spent years lifting things heavier than they should. His face was weathered past his age, and his jaw was set like he'd already decided this was a mistake. "Miss Vance," he said. "Not a question, Mr. Holt." She didn't offer her hand because he didn't move to take it. He looked at her trunk, then at her. His eyes were the color of creek water in November, gray with something brown underneath. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "You're quieter than the letter suggested," she said back. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. More like the acknowledgement that she'd returned fire and he hadn't expected it. He loaded the trunk without asking her to help, which she appreciated, and they drove the 11 miles to his property in almost complete silence. Sela watched the land roll past and understood, slowly, why people both loved and lost their minds out here. The sky was enormous. The grass was yellow and exhausted from a dry summer. The mountains sat on the western horizon like they were waiting for something. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was not what the letter had described. The letter had said, "Established cattle operation." What she saw was a house that needed paint, a barn that was losing its argument with gravity, and fencing that had been repaired so many times in different ways that it looked like something a child had stitched together from scraps. 2 small faces watched from the porch, a girl of about 7 and a boy younger, maybe 4, holding the girl's hand with the specific grip of someone who'd learned not to let go of things. "That's Petra and Jonas," Gideon said, climbing down from the wagon. "They know you're coming. Petra'll give you trouble for about 3 days. After that, she'll decide she likes you and pretend she always did." It was the most words he'd said since the platform. Sela filed that away. She stepped down from the wagon herself before he could offer or not offer assistance, walked up the porch steps, and crouched to be level with Jonas, who looked like he was about to cry from sheer overwhelm. "I'm Sela," she said. "I'm very good at making porridge and very bad at braiding hair. We should probably be honest about our limitations from the start." Petra's mouth twitched. Jonas, after a long moment of assessment, stuck out his small hand with tremendous seriousness. Sela shook it. That was how it started. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of practical honesty that suited everyone involved. The first week, she learned the house. It was a simple map of a man's grief. Things left exactly where a woman had put them years ago. Things that should have been replaced, but hadn't been. A pair of curtains in the kitchen that were faded to almost nothing, but still hung because no one had taken them down. She learned not to move things without asking, and she asked Petra rather than Gideon because Petra actually answered. "Mama put the flour there," Petra would say, or "That's where Mama kept the lamp." Not said to wound, just stated like facts of geography. Gideon's wife had been dead 2 years. Sela learned this from the storekeeper's wife in town, not from Gideon. She'd gone in for supplies, and the woman, broad-shouldered, kind-eyed, the sort who kept track of everything, had looked at Sela's dress and said, "You must be the new woman out at Holt's place. He's had a time of it since Cora passed." Cora. The name landed differently than she'd expected. It made the faded curtains mean something specific. The storekeeper's wife, whose name was Margaret Hess, talked for 12 minutes without much encouragement and told Sela most of what she needed to know. The drought had been brutal. The Holt Ranch had been profitable once, good land, reliable water from the creek that ran through the north pasture. Then the creek had been dammed upstream by a man named Theodore Pratt, who'd bought up 3 adjacent properties and fenced off the watershed. No water came through anymore. Gideon had been supplementing from a well that was going brackish, hauling what he could from the river, watching his cattle numbers drop. "He filed a complaint with the land office," Margaret said, dropping her voice not because anyone was nearby but from habit. "Twice. Both times it went nowhere. Pratt has friends in the regional office, if you understand me." Sela understood her perfectly. She'd grown up near enough to that kind of machinery to know how it worked. She drove back to the ranch and made dinner, and didn't say anything to Gideon about what she'd learned, because she needed more time to understand what kind of man he was before she decided how much she was going to care about his problems. The understanding came faster than she'd planned. It was the 3rd week. Jonas had a fever that climbed too high too fast, the way fevers did with small children, going from warm forehead to terrifying in the span of an afternoon. Sela had dealt with sickness. She'd nursed her mother through 2 years of it, so her hands stayed steady even when her chest didn't. She put Jonas in the coolest room, brought water, kept him talking when he was awake enough to talk. Gideon sat outside the door the entire night. He didn't come in unless she called him. He didn't leave. He sat on the floor in the hallway with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees, and every time she opened the door to get more water or a fresh cloth, he looked up at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be controlled and not quite making it. "He's going to be all right," she told him the second time she passed him. "The fever's not going higher. You sure?" "I'm sure enough to tell you." She paused. "If I weren't sure, I'd tell you that too." He was quiet for a moment. "Previous woman I hired lasted 2 weeks. Couldn't manage Jonas when he was sick. Said it wasn't what she'd agreed to." "I didn't agree to a list," Sela said. "I agreed to keep house and mind the children. Jonas is a child." He didn't say anything to that. But when she came out an hour later, he'd made tea and left a cup outside the door for her. By morning, the fever had broken. Jonas woke up and asked for toast with too much butter in a voice like gravel, which Petra called disgusting and made him anyway. Sela went out to the yard to breathe the morning air and found Gideon mending harness near the barn. He'd been awake all night too, she could tell from the way he moved. "Thank you," he said without looking up from the leather in his hands, "for staying calm. It didn't require courage, it required knowing what to do. That's rarer than courage most days." She thought about that for a while, then she went inside and made breakfast. The water problem came to a head in September, the way problems do when they've been building since spring. Not suddenly, but with a kind of inevitable wait. 2 of Gideon's remaining cattle died near the salt lick, dehydrated despite everything he'd been doing to compensate. He came in that evening and sat at the kitchen table without speaking, and Petra looked at him, and then at Sela with the specific expression of a child who has learned to read adults the way farmers read weather. Sela sent both children to bed early. Then she sat across from Gideon. "Tell me about Pratt," she said. He looked up. "You know about Pratt? Margaret Hess has a lot to say about a lot of things. Tell me your version." So he did. It came out in pieces, the way important things do from people who aren't used to talking. Theodore Pratt had arrived in the district 4 years ago with Eastern money and a lawyer and a plan. He'd bought up failing properties quietly at first, then with more pressure as people got desperate. The creek diversion was technically legal under a water license he'd obtained before anyone understood what he intended to do with it. The regional land office had his filings. His lawyer had made sure the paperwork was unassailable. "But the license is wrong," Sela said. "How do you mean?" "Water rights like that, diversion rights, they're granted for specific documented purposes." "What did Pratt say he needed the water for when he applied?" Gideon's eyes sharpened slightly. "He said he was irrigating new farmland on the north section." "And is he?" "That land's been sitting empty since he bought it." "He's not farming it, he's holding it." "Then his license is based on a stated purpose he's not fulfilling," Sela said. "That's not airtight. That's exploitable." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know anything about water licenses?" "My father spent 3 years trying to fight one in Ontario. He lost, but I spent those 3 years sitting next to him at every meeting, reading every document he brought home, understanding everything that went wrong." She folded her hands on the table. "He made the mistake of trying to be reasonable with people who had no reason to be reasonable back. That's a mistake I know how to avoid." There was a silence that was different in quality from the other silences she'd experienced at this table. This one wasn't empty, it was thinking. "I can't afford a lawyer," Gideon said finally, "and I can't afford to lose more time fighting something I might not win." "You can't afford not to. The well's going brackish. You've lost 7 cattle since spring." She kept her voice level. "What's your plan if nothing changes? How many more seasons does this place have?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Let me look at the license documentation," she said. "Before you decide it's hopeless, let me see what Pratt actually filed." Getting the documents took 2 trips to the regional office and a patience with bureaucratic obstruction that Sela had inherited from her mother, who'd spent years navigating a system that preferred women to go away. She didn't go away. She asked for the forms she was legally entitled to. She waited. She came back. She smiled pleasantly at men who were less pleasant back, and made note of their names without letting them see she was doing it. She returned to the ranch with copies of Theodore Pratt's original water license application and the survey documents filed with it. She spread them across the kitchen table at night after the children were in bed and went through them the way she'd watched her father do. Slowly, carefully, looking for the thing that didn't match the other things. She found it on the third night. The survey map attached to Pratt's application showed the diversion intake point in a different location than where it had actually been built. Not a large difference, maybe 200 yards. But 200 yards was the difference between Pratt's property line and the creek's natural course across what had been a shared access corridor used by 3 neighboring ranches for over 30 years. He'd built his dam outside the location described in his own license, on shared land, without any additional permission to do so. Sela sat very still for a moment, understanding what she was looking at. Then she went and knocked on the door of Gideon's room. He was awake. She'd noticed he slept badly, always had, and came to the door in the clothes he'd been wearing, which told her he hadn't been sleeping at all. "Come look at this," she said. He stood over the table and she walked him through it, showed him the map, showed him the actual intake location, watched his expression move through disbelief into something harder and more focused. "He built it in the wrong place," Gideon said. "He built it outside what his license permits, which means the license doesn't cover what he actually did, which means the diversion itself may not be legal." She tapped the map. "You need someone to certify the actual intake location, a surveyor who's not connected to Pratt's operation." "Cartwright," Gideon said, half to himself. Old Cartwright retired out past Millfield. He did the original boundary surveys for half this district 30 years ago. He's got no ties to Pratt. "Can you reach him?" "I can try." Gideon straightened up from the table, and for a moment they were closer together than they usually let themselves get. She was aware of it. She stepped back in a way that she hoped looked like moving to gather the papers. "This could still go wrong," he said. "Pratt's got connections. The regional office stalled my last 2 complaints. Your last 2 complaints were filed without evidence of specific violation. This is different." Sela held his gaze steadily. "And if the regional office stalls again, there's a federal land commission. Pratt's license involves Crown water allocation. That's Ottawa's jurisdiction, not the regional offices." Gideon studied her with that assessing look she'd been on the receiving end of since the day at the train platform. But it was different now, less weighing whether she'd be adequate, more trying to understand what she actually was. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "This isn't what you were hired for." Sela thought about her father's files, about his handwriting on documents that hadn't been enough, about the house that had gone to the bank and the doctor bills that had buried what came after. "I don't like to watch people lose things they shouldn't have to lose," she said. "And I'm useful. It would be a waste not to be." He didn't argue with that. She'd noticed he was good at not arguing with things that were simply true. Cartwright turned out to be a compact, precise man of about 70 who still walked the land like he owned it, even though he'd sold his property years ago. He came out on a Thursday, drove the survey stakes himself despite Gideon's offers to help, and confirmed what Sela's documents had suggested. The intake structure was built 183 yards outside the permitted location, on the old shared corridor access, without any easement or permission on record. "I'll put that in writing," Cartwright said, and his voice had the quality of a man who understood what his word meant and offered it carefully. "If this goes to the commission, I'll testify." 3 other ranching families had been affected by Pratt's diversion. Gideon knew them all. Sela had known, from the start of this, that the mistake would be to fight alone. It was the mistake her father had made, becoming one voice that could be dismissed as complaint rather than a pattern that had to be addressed. She suggested Gideon talk to the others. He did. 2 of them came out to the ranch the following week and sat around the table and looked at Cartwright's documentation and looked at each other. "I didn't think there was anything to be done," said one man. Broad, quiet, a Norwegian name she immediately forgot because he mostly communicated through silence and head movements. "There's always something," Sela said. "What changes is who's willing to do it." The Federal Land Commission filing took 2 weeks to prepare. She did most of the writing. Gideon checked every word, which she respected. He wasn't a man who signed his name to things he didn't understand, even when he understood them just fine, and was checking more from pride than uncertainty. She didn't say so. She let him check. They filed it together, Gideon and 2 of the other ranchers, with Cartwright's survey attached and a timeline of harm documented back 3 years. The filing went to Ottawa. They waited. Waiting was its own kind of work. October came, and the first hard frost turned the prairie silver in the mornings. Sela settled into routines that felt less provisional than they had in August. She learned Jonas's specific nightmares, the loud kind, the ones that weren't about anything recognizable, just fear in the dark, and she learned exactly how to sit with him until they passed without making too much of it. She learned that Petra read at a level 2 years above her age and was profoundly bored by the school reader she'd been given. So Sela wrote to the Toronto Library and asked them to send what they had on loan And 3 weeks later, a crate of books arrived that made Petra stand in the kitchen and go completely silent for a full 30 seconds. These are real books, Petra said finally. These aren't for children. Some of them are. Some of them you'll grow into. I'll tell you which is which. Sela paused. Or you can figure it out yourself and come back with questions. Petra chose the second option, as Sela had known she would. With Gideon, things were harder to navigate because neither of them talked much about what was happening, which was fine in the way that two people living alongside each other developed a fluency in the things that didn't need to be said. She knew when he was worried by the way he worked. Harder and more economically, nothing wasted. She knew when something had gone better than expected, because he came in for dinner 5 minutes earlier and poured himself coffee without the specific deliberateness of a man conserving something. She didn't know what he thought of her. She told herself it didn't matter, and was aware that it mattered more than it should. One evening in November, she was at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the temperature dropping outside, and she'd been writing a letter to the commission asking about timeline, which she did every 3 weeks to establish presence, if nothing else, and she looked up to find Gideon standing in the doorway with his coat still on, watching her. "How long have you been there?" she said. "Few minutes." He came in and poured coffee, and stayed at the counter rather than sitting, which was his way when he had something to say that he hadn't yet decided how to say. "I've been thinking." She waited. "When this is over, if the commission rules in our favor, the ranch might be viable again." He was looking at his cup. "I've been running the numbers. If the water comes back and we have a decent spring, I could rebuild the herd to something respectable in 2 seasons. "That's good," Sela said carefully. "I'd need help. Not just." He stopped. "I've been thinking about whether you'd want to stay." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. "As your housekeeper," she said. He looked up then. His expression was difficult to read in the way of people who've spent years not letting their expressions be read easily. "I was thinking something different than that. But I'm aware that I'm not easy to live with, and this place is isolated, and I haven't." He stopped again. "I'm not good at this. I noticed," she said, and she kept her voice even, "that you're very good at the things that matter and less practiced at the ones that don't. I don't particularly mind that. I'd want it to be a real arrangement, not an employment." He said it like a man reading a land title, deliberate and clear. "But you should know what you'd be walking into. The commission could still rule against us. The ranch could still fail. I have 2 children who aren't easy, and a grief I haven't entirely figured out how to carry. I know what I'd be walking into," Sela said. "I've been walking into it since August." He was quiet for a moment. Cora was. He stopped. "I'm not asking you to replace her. I know that too. I'm asking if you'd consider building something different, with me, on what's here." Sela thought about the $43 and the trunk that wouldn't close, and the woman at the agency who'd called it a fresh start, without really knowing what was behind her or what might be ahead. She thought about Jonas's hand in hers on the first day, and Petra's face when the books arrived and the survey map spread across this table, and Gideon checking every word she wrote, not because he doubted her, but because he was the kind of man who didn't sign his name to things carelessly. "Yes," she said. "I'd consider it." His exhale was barely audible. "All right, that's not a proposal," she said. "That's an opening position." Something moved through his expression that was unmistakably a smile. It was the first real one she'd seen from him, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated, softened the angles into something she hadn't expected. "I'll work on the formal version," he said. "Take your time," she said, "but not too much." The commission ruling came in December, 3 days before Christmas, in an envelope addressed to Gideon Holt and the co-filing parties. Sela was in the barn with Jonas when Gideon came to find her. He stood in the barn door with the letter in his hand, and she knew from the way he was standing, not tight, for the first time in months genuinely not tight, before he said a word. "They ruled in our favor," he said. "Pratt's intake structure has to be removed or relocated to the licensed position within 90 days. The shared corridor access is confirmed as community easement. His water diversions are suspended pending compliance." Jonas looked between them with the careful attention of a 4-year-old trying to understand what the adult's faces meant. "Does that mean the water comes back?" he asked. "It means the water comes back," Gideon said. Jonas considered this. "Good," he said, and went back to the extremely serious business of stacking hay bales in a configuration that made no structural sense, but clearly had deep personal significance. Sela looked at Gideon. He looked at her. "You wrote most of that filing," he said. "You signed your name to it. We did it together." "Yes," she said. "That seems to be how we do things." The silence that followed was the warmest one she'd experienced in that barn, or possibly in a long time before she'd ever arrived in Dunmore. Pratt didn't go quietly. Men like that rarely did. His lawyer filed 2 challenges that went nowhere because Cartwright's survey was unimpeachable, and because 2 of the other affected ranchers had found, with some guidance on Sela's part about what to look for, their own documentation of the corridor access predating Pratt's purchase by decades. He held out to the last week of the 90 days, then had the intake structure moved to the licensed position, which accomplished nothing useful for him and everything for the ranches downstream. The creek ran clear by February. Gideon stood at the fence and watched the water moving through the north pasture for a long time. Sela stood beside him. The children were at school. The morning was cold and bright in the way of prairie winters, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. "My father built this fence," Gideon said, "not about anything in particular." "I know," Sela said. She'd heard the story in pieces, his father coming west from Ontario, the land broken slowly over years, the specific pride of something made from nothing. "I thought I was going to lose it. For a while last summer, I was sure of it, but you didn't. We didn't." He turned to look at her, and this time there wasn't any of the assessment in it, none of the Winter Creek qualities she'd noticed at the train platform. There was something else, the kind of thing that only showed up in people who didn't show things easily, and so when they did, it was real in a way that couldn't be doubted. "I've been working on that formal version," he said. Sela had been waiting, in the patient way of someone who knew what they were waiting for and didn't need to rush it. "I know. I'm not going to be good at saying things properly. You should factor that in. I've factored it in." He looked at the creek for a moment more, then back at her. "Will you marry me, Sela?" Not quite a question. More like the way he filed paperwork. Deliberate, clear, committed. "Yes," she said. The same way she'd said it in November without performance. Because she meant it and meaning it was enough. Obviously, yes. He reached over and took her hand, which was only the 2nd or 3rd time he'd touched her since she'd arrived, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The creek moved through the north pasture, and the light moved across the fields, and somewhere behind them, the ranch that had been failing was still standing, same as it had been through all the seasons of difficulty, same as they intended it to stand. Spring came the way springs did after hard winters. Not gently, but with a kind of determination, everything pushing up at once through ground that had been locked. The cattle that remained were in better condition than they'd been in 2 years. The pasture that had been dry and cracked was soft and green along the creek corridor. Sela taught Jonas his letters on the kitchen table in the mornings before Petra left for school. She wrote back to the commission with a formal acknowledgement of the ruling, and kept copies of everything because she'd learned from her father what happened when you didn't. She planted a kitchen garden in a spot she'd identified in September as having the best drainage, which Gideon had looked at and said nothing, and then, without being asked, repaired the fence around it before the frost broke. Petra, who had decided she liked Sela approximately 3 days after her father predicted she would, and had been pretending she'd always liked her ever since, presented her with a drawing of the garden one morning, with the kind of studied casualness of a child trying not to be seen caring about something. "It's very good," Sela said, which was true. Petra had her father's precision. "It's just a drawing," Petra said. "I know. I'm going to put it on the wall." Petra's mouth did the thing it did when she was pleased and trying not to show it. "Fine," she said. The wedding was in April, small in front of the Justice of the Peace in Dunmore, with Margaret Hess and old Cartwright as witnesses, and Jonas asleep on Cartwright's coat in the corner, because the proceedings ran long and he was 4 and had limits. Petra stood very straight and serious throughout, which was her version of emotional. Gideon said his vows in the same voice he used for everything important. Quiet, deliberate, meaning every word. Sela said hers the same way. Afterwards, driving back to the ranch in the April light, Jonas awake again and sitting between them watching the road. Petra on Sela's other side with her arm pressed against Sela's arm, in a way that she would certainly deny was deliberate, Gideon said without looking over. "You could have left. After the first month. Most people would have." "I'm not most people," Sela said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." The land opened up ahead of them, wide and still a little harsh, the mountains holding their position on the horizon the same as they had the day she'd arrived. The creek was running. The pasture was green. The fence her father-in-law had built was still standing. She had $43 when she got off that train. She hadn't counted what she had now in any terms that were measurable the same way. Some things you only knew the value of once you'd stopped being afraid to want them.